The first time we stepped into this neighborhood, I thought we had finally found home. The streets were lined with well-kept gardens, and the air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass. It was peaceful, the kind of place where people smiled at each other in passing, and porch lights glowed like silent beacons of safety. For the first few weeks, it felt exactly like that. Chris and I unpacked our lives into this house, filling every corner with laughter, with love. Even the smallest things, making breakfast together, arguing over paint colors for the living room, felt like pieces of a dream finally taking shape. Then, there was Mr. Dawson. At first, he was just a shadow in the background, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, always standing on his porch, always watching. He never waved back when we greeted him. His gaze would linger a second too long, cold and unreadable. I tried to brush it off, telling myself some people just weren't friendly. But Chris noticed it too. "He doesn't like us," Chris murmured one evening as we sat on our porch swing, fingers laced together. The golden hues of the setting sun painted his face in soft light, but there was a crease between his brows, a weight to his voice. I sighed. Maybe he's just old-fashioned. Chris turned to me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Or maybe it's more than that. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were there. The way conversations among neighbors seemed to die down when we approached. The disapproving glances from certain people. The way Mr. Dawson's lips pressed into a thin line whenever we walked past. Then came the first real incident. It was a Sunday afternoon. Chris and I had spent the morning planting flowers in the front yard, laughing as we got more soil on each other than in the pots. As we finished, I heard it, a low, muttered comment from across the street. "Disgusting." I turned, and there he was, Mr. Dawson, standing on his porch, arms crossed. His eyes, sharp as broken glass, locked onto us. My chest tightened. It wasn't loud enough to be a confrontation, just enough to let us know exactly how he felt. Chris's fingers tightened around mine, but he said nothing. Neither did I. That night, as we lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying that moment. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, something unsettled me. Something told me this was only the beginning. It started small, almost insignificant. The morning after Mr. Dawson's muttered insult, our garbage bins were knocked over, trash strewn across the driveway. At first, I thought maybe a raccoon had gotten into them. But when it happened again the next day, and the day after that, I wasn't so sure. Chris wasn't either. "We should get security cameras," he said, arms crossed as he surveyed the mess. His jaw was tight, his usual warmth dimmed by a quiet frustration. I nodded, bending down to pick up the garbage, but the uneasy feeling in my gut didn't go away. Then came the note. It was taped to our front door, plain white paper with jagged, uneven letters scrawled in black ink. "You don't belong here. Leave." A chill ran down my spine. Chris took the paper from my hands, reading it twice before crumpling it into a tight fist. I saw the muscles in his arm flex, his fingers trembling slightly. Anger and hurt warred in his expression. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, turning toward the street. "We're not going anywhere." I wasn't so sure. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside made my heart hammer in my chest. I kept thinking about the note, about how the letters looked rushed, like they had been scratched onto the paper in anger. I imagined Mr. Dawson standing at our door, pressing the tape against the wood, his face twisted in disdain. The next day, I woke up to a flat tire on my car. Chris found it first. "Nail in the sidewall," he grumbled, tossing his phone onto the counter after calling a tow truck. This wasn't an accident. I swallowed hard. It was becoming harder to ignore the truth. Someone, Mr. Dawson, most likely, wanted us gone. But the worst part, no one said a word. Our neighbors saw the trash, the note, the flat tire. They saw Chris, red-faced with frustration, trying to scrub spray paint off our fence after someone had tagged the word sinners across it in dripping red letters. But no one spoke up. At first, I tried to justify it. Maybe they didn't want to get involved. Maybe they didn't think it was their place. But deep down, I knew the truth. They were watching, just like they always had. They just didn't care. Chris sat beside me that evening, taking my hand in his. "We're not leaving," he said firmly, his grip warm and steady despite everything. "I don't care what they do. This is our home." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe we could fight this. But as I looked out the window, watching Mr. Dawson, standing on his porch, smirking as if he had already won, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. The night it all boiled over, I should have seen it coming. Chris and I had spent the evening indoors, curtains drawn, pretending not to hear the occasional scrape of footsteps outside. We knew better than to look. We knew Mr. Dawson wanted us to react. But at 2 a.m., a sharp bang shattered the silence. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. Another bang followed, then another. Someone was hammering at our door. Chris was already moving. "Stay here," he ordered, but I was right behind him. As he flicked on the porch light, my stomach twisted. There, in red spray paint, was the word abomination scrawled across our door. And standing on our lawn, hands shoved in his pockets, was Mr. Dawson. Chris's hands clenched into fists, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I whispered. But Dawson just chuckled, his grin dripping with smug satisfaction. He wanted us angry. He wanted us broken. "Neighborhood's got standards," he drawled, nodding toward our vandalized door. "And you too. You're lowering them." Chris shook under my grip. "You need to leave." Dawson's smile widened. "Or what?" I didn't know what scared me more, his words or the way he spoke them, like he already knew we'd lose. For the first time, I felt helpless. By the time we called the police, Dawson was already gone. The officer who showed up, a tired-looking man with graying hair, glanced at the paint, then at us. "You actually see him do it?" Chris exhaled sharply. He was standing right there. The officer scribbled something in his notepad, but I already knew what he'd say before he did. No proof, no charges. My hands balled into fists. "So that's it." The officer sighed, closing his notepad. "Look, best advice? Lay low. People like him," he glanced at the door, then back at us. "They don't stop unless they get a reaction." Chris scoffed. "So, we're just supposed to take it." A pause. Then softer. "I'm saying be careful." It wasn't enough. That night, Chris barely spoke. He just sat by the window, staring at the street. I could see it in his eyes, the exhaustion, the anger, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered. Chris didn't look at me. "Then what do we do?" I had no answer. But as I glanced outside, I saw it, Dawson, standing in the glow of his porch light, watching, smiling. And that's when I knew. This wouldn't end unless we ended it first. The next morning, something in Chris shifted. I saw it in the way he carried himself. No more frustration, no more helplessness. Just a quiet, simmering determination. "We're not running," he said over coffee, voice steady. "But we're not just taking it anymore either." He had a plan. First, we set up cameras, high-resolution motion detecting with night vision. Every angle of the house covered. This time, there'd be proof. Then, we started talking. For months, we'd kept our heads down, hoping Dawson's hatred would burn itself out. But silence had given him power. So we did the opposite. We told our story, to neighbors online, to anyone who'd listen. I wrote a post about the harassment, attaching pictures of the vandalism, the threats. Chris reached out to LGBTQ+ organizations, journalists, even a lawyer. And then the biggest move. The city had a zero-tolerance policy on harassment and discrimination. But policies don't work unless people use them. Chris filed an official complaint, not just against Dawson, but against the entire HOA for their silence. The reaction was immediate. Within hours of our post going viral, comments flooded in. People offering support, lawyers volunteering pro bono, even strangers in the city rallying behind us. And then, the cameras did their job. That night, at exactly 1:14 a.m., Dawson was caught spray painting our garage. In clear HD footage, there he was, a man who had spent months terrorizing us, now exposed for the world to see. We called the police again. This time, there was no tired sigh, no dismissive shrug. This time, Dawson was arrested. The HOA, scrambling to save face, publicly condemned his actions. His name, once a whispered threat, became a disgrace in the community. And just like that, the power shifted. A week later, as we sat on our porch, coffee in hand, I saw a moving truck in Dawson's driveway. Chris followed my gaze, a slow smirk forming. Guess he finally took his own advice. I exhaled, the weight of months of fear and anger lifting off my chest. We hadn't just survived, we'd won. That night, for the first time in a long time, I slept soundly. Because this was our home. And we weren't leaving.